Hello and welcome to the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University in Qatar. I'm Susie Morgani, editor at CIRS, and welcome to our third community discussion. This is the Cinematic Afterlives Research Initiative. And this project, we aim to be more than just a film series, and we want to create a space for social engagement with cinema and with the history of slavery in the Black Atlantic. We use a variety of lectures and panels, film screenings, and audience discussions. The project will also encourage greater attention to the connections between histories and the afterlives of slavery in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. So today's community discussion revolves around the 2013 film Tula, the Revolt. Our discussant today is Professor Trish Kahle, who also serves as the project's faculty lead. Welcome, Trish. And just by way of introduction, Professor Kahle received a PhD in history from the University of Chicago, and she's a historian of energy, work, and politics in the modern United States and the world. So normally, Professor Kahle, you're behind the scenes, you're leading the project, but today we have the pleasure of hearing from you directly, your thoughts about the film and how it connects to the larger research project. So I'm going to start this conversation on a bomb note, which is about violence, which is about the extreme violence in this film and in a lot of the films that we've seen in this series, obviously, when we're dealing with issues like slavery. So colonial empires depicted themselves as civilizing missions, and yet the very first scene of this film starts with the most horrific sentencing of Tula and his comrades. And it's horrible things, beheadings, breaking bones, just terrible imagery is given to us in verbal form, and given to us in such a casual, benign, kind of blasé, bureaucratic way. And it reminded me, obviously, of Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil. This is just, he's listing, it's like a shopping list of horrors that he's giving us. So I wonder if you can just start this conversation about slave revolts and how they were positioned in the history of revolution.
Absolutely. And I think the kinds of violence that we see, both initiated at the beginning of the film and then again throughout, are really something that are taking place across the Caribbean and across the slave societies of the Americas as a way of sort of dealing with the fact that, the white ideas about what slave political thought was capable of were really rooted in the idea that rebellion could not exist, and yet had to deal with, as Michel Rothschild had said, the fact that it did exist, right? And so they're left with sort of this inability to navigate that basic contradiction, to make sense of revolts when they unfolded. And so as a result, they were dealt with extreme violence in order to maintain the system of plantation slavery. And I think it's not an accident in that sense that this is the second film in this series to take place with the Haitian Revolution unfolding off screen. And so in both Tula, the Revolt, and La Última Cena, the Haitian Revolution is never seen, but it actually ends up playing a really central part in driving the plot forward. And so the violence on screen is in some ways reflective of the incredible anxiety of whites in slave societies as they feared sort of the Haitian Revolution spreading both across the Caribbean and across the broader Americas. And so while this period is sort of one of widespread political, economic, and social upheaval, Haiti really does have this central place in the story when we look at it from the perspective of the Black diaspora in the Americas. And yet it's really not usually the piece of the age of revolutions that's really at the center of the story. And so instead, we see really this sort of incredible violence as a way of writing the idea of slave revolution out of history, both by the colonists in Curacao, as well as in other places around the Americas.
Yeah, and the violence of the colonizer is also kind of opposed to Tula's he wants to go by the law, right? So he wants his freedom according to the law. So then you see this great opposition between what is supposed to be the upholders of the law, who are the colonists, and the slaves demanding rights, not just revolting in that violent manner, but demanding that they get their freedom through a series of rights.
Well, I think what's so critical about this, right? I was actually just before our conversation revisiting Trio's Silencing the Past, and he deals with this question about like, how is it possible that you have this kind of tension by really exposing what we would come to see as sort of these things that claim to be universal, right? These ideas of liberty, equality, and brotherhood as being pushed to their furthest conclusion by the practice of slave revolution, right? And so on the one hand, when we say that there are sort of these laws that the enslaved people in the film sort of see themselves as fighting for inclusion within or to expand, right? That's not really how white colonists would have seen it. And so they were doing something that was, again, using Trio's words, right, unthinkable to the white colonists within the bounds of their law, within the sort of legal framework that they had to understand the world. And so on the one hand, this is using a framework today of rights that would come to be really widespread throughout the world in the centuries after the Haitian Revolution, after these revolts. But at the time, really was far beyond what any of their proponents in the United States or in France could have imagined by themselves.
Exactly. And you mentioned the Haitian Revolution quite a bit because it does figure centrally in this film as well as the motive or the motivation or the catalyst for Tula's revolt, because here we get the nexus between power and knowledge, right? So the knowledge that he gets from his betrothed or from his lover is that she overhears that the French have overtaken the Dutch and that Haiti has successfully, I believe, revolted. So it's that knowledge that gives him the power and the motivation to actually stand up for himself and to demand his rights. And we see him in the very beginning as someone who's already portrayed heroically. He's already a man apart. He's already someone who doesn't take the sacrament along with his fellow slaves. So even though he is portrayed as a heroic figure, it's only that knowledge that makes him stand up and revolt. Can you just talk a little bit more about that nexus between knowledge and power?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the really interesting places where the film really flattens a really key part of the history that would have been really interesting to actually fully include, right? So we have that scene where Speranza overhears this discussion between I think Van Utrecht and this other planter, and claims she hasn't heard anything, and then runs off to tell Tula that simultaneously that the French have overtaken the Dutch Republic, right? And so therefore they're under French rule. And then simultaneously that in France, the National Assembly has finally abolished slavery, right? Which happens in the fall of 1794. And so that she takes these 2 points of knowledge back without any real sense of like how the enslaved people on the plantation are meant to interpret them. And yet the response to them suggests that there's a much wider and deeper knowledge of unfolding events than would be suggested by this thing where she's meant to have overheard it one time, right? And sort of taken this to run with it. It both speaks, I think, to the danger that the revolution in Haiti presents to white power throughout the Caribbean. But it also, I think, suggests that there is a much wider circuit of knowledge circulation, of information and political thought within the Black Caribbean. And we actually do know that that was the case. And in fact, Curacao, which is sort of presented to us as this island where no one can leave or go, was in fact a center of circulation in the Caribbean.
It says that in the beginning of the film, right? It says that
right.
In the beginning, it says it's an island and you cannot get off, or something very dramatic like that.
Right, and in fact, I mean, so that it sort of flattens the movement in two ways. First, that Curacao really figured centrally as a place where ships carrying captives would stop and unload the cargo, and sort of where, so it was enslaved people's entry into the Americas and into the Caribbean through this island. but also because so much that the land as we see is very arid, right? It's not one of these very rich, sugar plantation islands like a place like Martinique or Haiti. And so you actually have it sort of being a place of trade circulation where there's ships and trade moving back and forth. And in fact, there's a substantial free population of color on the island that has extensive trade relationships with the southern part of Saint-Domingue or Haiti. And so all of these sort of networks where you actually do have people moving on and off the island onto ships where they may have less, or they might have a little bit more freedom to move around and to speak than they would while they were on the island. And all of that really gets removed from this context. We just get this one piece of information. And I think, without that bigger sense of the, what Julia Scott called the common wind of sort of circulating both political thought, rebellion, and information around the Black Caribbean and the Black Atlantic, we really can't understand how so quickly Tula and his comrades are able to sort of take on both the language of the French Revolution, like where do they even get the slogans from, and be able to turn that so quickly into political action.
Yeah, and so these are decisions, right, made by the filmmaker, what to include in the narrative and what to exclude. And, cinematically, it works that this is kind of a love story centered in the middle of a struggle, right? So the historical detail sometimes gets discarded in favor of the more universally cinematic themes of love and struggle. So I want to talk a little bit about film funding and narrative production. So I know that you have done a lot of background research on this film as well, not just looking at the film from its content, from the point of view of its content, but also how the film was made and how money was gathered to make the film. So in the US film industry, it's an industry, it's a business, right? So you have to make a product, at least especially within the US film industry, you have to make a product, a film that is going to give you returns on your investment. This is the way that it has been structured. There are very few independent production houses in the US. Film Independent is one of them that works directly, I believe, with the US government. In the European model, it's very different. It's grant-based and it's government grant-based mostly, so that there are more people involved in the decision-making, which kind of is supposed to make it more democratic in terms of the stories that are told and how they are told. I know for a fact, so I'm also a filmmaker, and I've been trying to gather funding for the last year for my first feature, Cotton Queen. And I know for a fact that there are certain ways of presenting your project that is more appealing, as a love story, for example, less with the history, and especially during the time of COVID, by the way, in the last year, nobody wants negative. Don't give us negative, even if it's a serious story, tell it in a lighthearted way. Can you dress this differently? These are decisions that you have to make both as a filmmaker and as the funder. In order to get the film made. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how this film was made, or what struggles the film went through before it was made.
Yeah, so what originally attracted me to this film was actually the presence of one of the cast members, Danny Glover. And so Glover, I guess, is better known for Lethal Weapon, which is a series I've personally never seen, but he's also sort of a lifelong, I have not seen it, but he is a lifelong, oh really? Yeah, so he's a lifelong activist though, and I actually learned that, he was at San Francisco State University during the longest student walkout in history, where, it ultimately led to the founding of a Black Studies program. And, that's so since I think that would have been the late 60s, right? He's been deeply involved both in sort of internationalist politics, as well as specifically trying to get Black stories on screen and on stage. And one of the projects that he had been deeply invested in for a long time was actually an epic film about Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. And another connection to this film, right, is that some of the characters in the film actually in real life had adopted the names of these revolutionaries, like Toussaint Louverture, André Rigaud. But so in any case, Glover was really committed to this idea of making this epic story about Toussaint's life, and had really struggled to gain funding for the film precisely because of this model that you've outlined. One of the reasons that he was given was that there were not white heroes in the film. And so it's, spoiler alert, the Haitian Revolution does not have white heroes, right? It's a story of slave insurrection and Black self-liberation. And so it didn't really fit the model of films about slavery and its abolition that we see, right? So like probably the paradigmatic case is Steven Spielberg's Amistad, which is, problematic in so many profound ways, right? In terms of who gets to speak, who sort of has agency within the film. And so this film, in some ways, by both having sort of the specter of the Haitian Revolution over the story, it has it over it in a second way as well, with sort of Danny Glover trying to bring slave revolt onto screen. And so, he was ultimately able to get a promise of some funding from the Venezuelan government, but it was only for about half of the funding the film actually needed to be successful, and he was never able to raise the private equity for the other part of the film's funding. And so the film still has not been made, though he says he would still like to make it. But the Haitian scholar Alyssa Goldstein-Steppenwall has really suggested that the unrepresentability of Haiti on film, which dates back to the 1930s, right, when Paul Robeson actually tried to make a film about Haiti with Sergei Eisenstein, that is really an element of this idea of a revolution among enslaved people being unthinkable. So it really goes back, it's just something that is difficult to represent on screen on the terms that films are made. And so in that sense, right, for all of this film's limitations, I think it does succeed in some of those ways, right, in terms of putting Black political thought and agency at the center of the film, right? Those are the only characters we see who actually get real political development or political scenes. But at the same time, I think it also is a representation of how little funding is available to tell these kinds of stories and the kind of danger they still represent today to the sort of typical narratives we have about remembering slavery.
Right. Yeah, we have advanced somewhat, so this film was 2013, I believe. So in the last decade, there has been some movement towards funding specifically for stories about people of color, having the heroes or the protagonists or the central stories about whether it's the African diaspora or just having that kind of representation in the last few years, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the people boycotting the Oscars, the Oscars So White campaign and that. So Array Films is a organization that we've worked closely with in the last year, trying to get screening rights for another film, and their president or founder is Ava DuVernay, who's really pushing for these kinds of stories to be seen. So there's some movement.
No, definitely, and I think in some ways, right, the films that we're going to be looking at from Array also are building on another legacy of Glover's, right, which is he actually created, I'm not sure exactly, you probably know better what the exact term for this is, a production house maybe, called Louverture Films, that while it has not been able to yet bring tuition this epic about Toussaint, has nonetheless been able to, help create films like Bamako, which is one of my favorite films, set in Bamako, Mali, and a bunch of other stories, both from the Black diaspora and the global South. And so, in some sense, right, the inability to produce this one film has also helped create the communities that have made a lot of other different kinds of films on related issues.
Absolutely. So let's just talk a little bit about gender and gender relations in this film, because it's very interesting. It's something that I don't think is fully realized in this film, that the cry for freedom and brotherhood, it is the cry for brotherhood, rather than, for humanity. So this is Tula's Revolt is based on that slogan. And then we see that the white man's club is quite literally replaced by the slave club or the revolting slave club when they take over the mansion and they sit around the table drinking their, you know, little shots of whiskey or whatever it is in their crystal tumblers. So it's almost just a direct replacement of the white men with the black men. And we see the women as being concerned about their clothing, their dress. The first thing they do is rush into the house to put on the pretty frocks of whoever had inhabited that house previously. So I wonder if you could just give us a few pointers about gender in this film.
Yeah, I mean, I think gender happens in really interesting ways, both in terms of what the limits of how it's represented show us, as well as, I think, you know, trying to take the past on its own terms. And so, you know, I think when I see the scenes of them going into the house and grabbing the dresses, I see this sort of in the broader sense of, you know, the ways that particular forms of dress connote wealth and particular kinds of social status. Right. And so I think Speranza says something along the lines of like, I won't be the kind of freed woman who still wears slave rags. Right. And so that even this idea that somehow this sort of bourgeois style of clothing can somehow connote one's status as a freed person is, I think there's something really interesting there, though I agree it's really underdeveloped. But I think more broadly, right, Speranza is such an interesting character because in a lot of ways, she's used really instrumentally in the film, right? She sort of is there to advance the plot along, but we don't really get as much of her as a character as we might. And, you know, as I was watching this, it really becomes clear that we're seeing this from the masculine perspective, particularly of Tula, right? That it's not just sort of this film that's telling a story about this group of rebels in total, right? It's really about the perspective of, you know, an enslaved person claiming manhood, claiming brotherhood, and sort of projecting that outward on to the women around them in the revolt. And because everything we know about slave revolts, slave revolution, is that women were involved and often participated extensively in these revolts. And so really what we're seeing is one particular kind of perspective. And that's why I think our next film, Harriet, is such an important sort of rejoinder to that, right? By putting a woman at the center of the story.
Exactly. So then can we talk about the one woman who does stand out very much, both visually and politically, and that is Mrs. Lazier, who is a white aristocratic Dutch woman, I assume Dutch.
Yeah, I mean, she seems definitely like that compromise, right? Of like in between only having sort of this cast of, you know, Dutch white characters who come off, you know, almost comically evil in some cases, right? And then even as they're inhabiting these roles, which are historically quite accurate, right? But the sort of the way that they're played I just think it comes off in some ways, right? Like comically evil at points. And, you know, she's sort of this rejoinder that at the same time, it suggests sort of these broader currents of instability within pro-slavery thought, within these colonial societies. At the same time, really is sort of maybe easing the viewer's gaze through the film. Like, I'm not quite sure what you make of that, but on the one hand, you can sort of see her as doing that, right? Of sort of being this sort of halfway in between. We would not go so far as to call her even cast as a white hero, even in the most generous reading of her. I think I read her as a little bit more malicious in the sense that she really is very good at playing both sides to save her own skin, and sort of using her position as a white woman within that society to gain particular advantages, to both, on the one hand, appear less threatening to the rebels in one context, right? And sort of be saying like, you know, you can stay at my house. And of course she leaves, right? She doesn't participate in the rebellion at all.
That's one way to get out unscathed.
Exactly. And then, you know, but when she's chastised by the governor, right, we sort at the end of the film, we do get the sense that she may have somehow participated in this before, which is, I think, what really does lend her character with some level of genuine ambiguity. But at the same time, you know, there's a remark that her man, right, which is, it's left unclear whether or not he is if he's free or enslaved, though I think I sort of take from the tenor of the film that she is enslaving him, that he has died in order to maintain her freedom, right? And they say that, okay, he gave himself up for you, but right, we have to wonder about the possibility of coercion behind that apparent choice, right?
Yeah.
And so he's killed and executed while she's able to sort of escape chastised, but still free and still with her privilege to move about wherever she likes.
I guess the one scene in which she kind of does stick her neck out without any motivation and without any immediate danger around her is when she asks the priest to ride with her. And then she kind of asks him or tells him to stand up for the slaves, or, you know, that he, as a priest or as a symbol of religion, has a different role to play in all of this, and that maybe he can ease the tensions.
Well, I mean, there's actually also, I realized, another scene as well, which is where she stops in the woods, right? And so she stops in the woods to take on someone who's injured. She brings him back to her home and they sort of nurse him back to health. But I think both her and the priest, right, are again sort of filling those roles that are sort of ambiguous in betweens, right, where the priest is simultaneously able to, you know, use, for example, food to coerce enslaved people into practicing the rituals of Christianity, while at the same time, at one point, being clearly willing to accept sort of the infusion of other older African religious traditions and Creole religious traditions into those rituals later in the film. But in some ways, right, like I actually wonder if that just sort of hardens the two sides, right? We have the rebels on the one hand and the colonial Dutch on the other. And again, not really any sense of the much wider group of colonial Dutch who are on the islands, right? It seems like a very small clique when in fact there were a fairly substantial number of whites who were there, including soldiers and sailors, right, who had their own reasons for discontent. And of course, a big free population of color on the island as well, who had, you know, their own interests at the same time. But the priest and both Mrs. I'm blanking on her name again.
Lazier, I think. Lazier.
Mrs. Lazier. Both of them are sort of these middling characters in that sense that I think ultimately just serve to harden the either or, because they're so individual standouts among them.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%, because they're kind of the glue that binds the opposite sides, right? They're the go-betweens. They're the people that would make both the arguments of both sides sound better to each side, right? They would be that go-between. So then just going back to the priest and going back to the role of religion, or how religion is portrayed, not only in this film, but within the wider colonial context. A few weeks ago, we watched La Ultima Cena, which was centered around the Last Supper, you know, which is a highly dramatized religious setting or mise en scène. And we had the same kind of idea of this priest who is that go-between between the colonists and the slaves. So can you just talk a little bit more about how religion is portrayed in this film and within the wider context as well?
Definitely. I mean, I'll sort of lead off by just saying, like, I'm not a historian of religion, so I can't go very far in sort of how far I can push this, but I can just, you know, state my observation in terms of you know, in both La Ultima Cena and this film, similarly, right, the priest in both places plays a role where, because of his religion, he's able to sort of see the humanity of the enslaved people on the plantation or of the rebels, right? But at the same time, right, like that sort of stands in opposition to what we know as being the role of the church in maintaining these systems of hierarchy. And what's interesting about this film, right, is he does actually say that at one point, right, that he can't sort of, in this conversation with Mrs. Lazier, right, that he can't actually sort of embrace the idea of ending slavery because there is no, his position in the colonial society is so centrally balanced between maintaining the system of domination and supporting the expansion of the state. And it's really interesting that he just sort of comes out and says that so bluntly, that he's so clear about his own position. and that he's able to embrace that contradiction without any sort of seeming moral angst, really, right? Like he never really has that moment of where he really comes to regret his decision, or really see himself as the cause of any of the violence, even though, again, right, he is really a central figure, both in the terms of the communication between the two sides. He really is able to somehow perceive himself as neutral, or at least as a benevolent colonizer. And I think there are elements that you see of that in a lot of the other films, that both of the ones we have and haven't seen yet, where you have, these religious figures really embracing the sort of contradictions that they live in and not really seeing them as contradictions. But I think that's why a critical lens on the films is so important, right? Because we can't take their own perspective on their position as sort of at face value. And that's why it's so critical, again, to sort of adopt a sort of a Black perspective on the film, take the perspective of the enslaved, of the rebels, and sort of use that to look back on these colonial enslaved societies.
Exactly. Well, I'm gonna end this discussion on the framing of the framing device of the film, which is to try to bring us back to the beginning of our discussion, which is also the beginning of the film, which is the same scene, the same opening scene of Tula is towards the end. It's towards the end as well, but it's given to us in a very different way. So in the beginning, we have the sentencing of Tula, and it is filled with, this is the end, they're going to be executed. And so there's not a lot of room for hope in the beginning of the film. And so you as an audience member already know that this is, they are doomed, that their mission for the next 2 hours or however long the film is doomed. But I think, irrespective of the fact that I don't think the film is cinematically inventive in any kind of way, it is melodramatic. There are strings and violins coming in at all the right times to trigger the audience's emotional responses. But it does do something very clever, which is the fade to black every few seconds in the beginning of the film gives us space towards the end of the film that is then filled with hope. And it's filled with the singing of the women of the chorus outside. It's filled with a different kind of take, a different kind of music, different angles, a different perspective. So what was given to you as doom in the beginning is actually filled with hope towards the end. And then obviously we have the literal rebirth of Tula and his son, his namesake, also Tula. So I wonder if you just have any closing remarks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a really interesting framing device. As a historian, it kind of chafes against my hope to embrace the sort of contingency of the moment, right? Especially because what we know is happening off screen is indeed, the first successful slave revolution that ever sort of breaks through modern history. And the recognizing that at the time that this is unfolding, that outcome is not guaranteed. Right? Independence in Haiti isn't declared till 1804. So it's still almost a decade, right? In which people across the Caribbean, enslaved people across the Caribbean, will be really trying to universalize these things that in the French and American revolutions claimed universality, but were really only for whites. And in this film, because we have that framing device, right? That moment of contingency and possibility is undermined and instead replaced with this idea of sort of slow amelioration, which ironically, right, was in fact the French colonial policy once Napoleon reinstates slavery on the French Antilles, I think in 1802. And so it's that idea, and the cards at the end of the film read, right, like, but conditions on the plantation improved, right, and things like this, which I think in some ways both undermines and just cuts off the real political content of Tula's revolt, right? Which was, I think, much more expansive and radical as it was portrayed. But in some ways, right, like, I don't know, I guess I would love to hear what your thoughts are about that in some way, but, that replacing contingency with amelioration, I think is
well, that's
an interesting way to end the film.
That's the friction between historical fact and the choices that are made for the screen, right? So those are exactly the interstice between what narratives are portrayed cinematically or can be portrayed cinematically, and which ones just don't work.
Well, and that actually, I think, brings us back to this earlier point about the ability to represent slave revolution on screen, right? And so I was just thinking about, like, what would it really mean to fully embrace contingency in that kind of storytelling? It must be, not as a filmmaker, but from my perspective, but I can imagine from your perspective, like putting a script together like that, you know, trying to embrace the possibility of something that had never happened before, right? That was unthinkable on the terms of all of the actors involved, not just the whites, right? But, you know, if we go back to Triot's evaluation of the Haitian Revolution, right, that even for the people who were participating in it, that it was unthinkable in words and they had to think it in deed, right? And so they made slave revolution in deed before it could be thought. And I can't imagine how difficult that would be to actually write a script that really embraced that possibility.
Yes. Not just writing the script, but then trying to get funding based on that script and trying to convince others of what you believe. Thank you so much, Professor Kahle, for your great insights on the film Tula, and we look forward to our next screenings in March and April. Thank you.
Thank you.